Now, while all those events had been unfolding in Europe, over in the Pacific, Japan was expanding as well. Japan had learned uh, to westernize when actually the United States in the 1840s forced them to open trade with the world. And they took a look at the Western world and the power of the West, and they said, we can't beat them, we've got to join them. We've got to industrialize, we've got to build a modern military, a modern army, a modern navy. We've got to be like the West. And so they learned to play our game, and they learned to build an empire. And they were getting good at that. But after World War I, the West starts trying to disassemble imperialism and get rid of empires. But Japan is just starting to win the game, and they don't want to go backwards. They can't if they're going to continue to be an industrialized island. They don't have lots of resources. So Japan is in the 1930s looking to expand as well. So first of all, they expand into Manchuria, a province claimed by China that Japan centuries ago had briefly held up for a short period of time. And so they claim that traditionally it's theirs, which that's highly doubtful. But they make that claim, and because China was busy having its own war, the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, who we supported, were fighting the communists led by Mao Zedong. And since they're at war with each other, they're not prepared to fight the Japanese. And the Japanese took Manchuria, and so there kind of became a stalemate, a standoff at the border between Manchuria and the rest of China. Troops were massed there, but China couldn't drive them out. Eventually, the Japanese in 1937 then invaded China, the rest of China. They sparked a little incident at a bridge there, blamed the Chinese for shooting first, but in fact they started it. And then they pour into China. They start taking China over. At this point, the communists and the nationalists both start fighting the Japanese. But by this time, it's too late. Japan is overrunning their country. We, the United States, we're against what Japan is doing, and we're condemning them for it, but we're still selling them scrap metal for their war machine. We're still selling them fuel because we're not ready for war with them. And Roosevelt knows, the government knows, if we cut off trade with them, well, then we're probably going to find them at war with us. As long as we're selling them stuff, they're not going to attack us. They'll keep buying what they can from us. And so we tell them, no, don't do that, but we keep selling them war materials. But at the same time, we're sending war materials to the Chinese, and even American volunteers like the Flying Tigers go over there to fight for China. So we're rooting for and helping China, but we're still selling materials to the enemy. Well, finally, in 1941, with the war going in Europe and with the Japanese continuing to take over parts of China and Asia, finally the United States draws the line and cuts off oil to the Japanese. So at this point, Japan decides, all right, there's no reason to make nice with the United States anymore, and they're the only country left at this point. England's too busy with the war in Europe. The Germans are on our side. Nobody's going to stop us except the U.S., so all we need to do is thump them real good. They'll back down, and we'll own the Pacific. So that's exactly what they did. Across the Pacific, right in the middle of it, is Hawaii. That was our major naval base. And they figured if we attack the U.S. fleet there and hit it hard, the Americans will back down because obviously they're cowards. They're not fighting. Europe's at war, Asia's at war, and America's hiding on its side of the world. They don't want trouble. They'll back down. So on December 7th, 1941, they attacked our fleet at Pearl Harbor. And they damaged or sunk every one of our 8 battleships. What they didn't managed to damage, because they were not in the harbor that day, were our aircraft carriers. And actually, the attack at Pearl Harbor proved that battleships were now the past. Now the real might of a fleet are your aircraft carriers, which can bring your planes close enough to attack the enemy from the air. So the American fleet, although damaged and although America's shocked, we're still going to have the aircraft carriers we need to continue the fight against the Japanese, now that we are in the fight. The very next day, on December 8th, President Roosevelt steps in front of Congress and asks for a declaration of war. So now the United States is in the war. Now we've got to gear up for war. So first of all, we've already been through the Lend-Lease Act, giving war supplies and materials to the British to help them fight the Nazis. And we've been helping the Chinese. Well, now we're going to start producing our own materials to enter the war. And we're going to start rationing again and scrap metal drives. And we're going to have all kinds of people volunteering to help the war effort. As men go off to fight, Rosie the Riveter, women are going to step into those roles in a bigger scale than they ever had before to produce the materials we need in the factories while the men go off to fight. So America is gearing up for war, and we're not only going to supply our own troops and outproduce the Axis powers, but we're going to be supplying, to some degree, the Russians and the English and the other allies. And since we're over here on the other side of this ocean with a powerful navy, the Nazis, they can never bomb our factories. The Japanese can't cut our ability to produce goods. But as the war progresses, we're going to build up our Navy, build up our Air Force. We'll gain more and more ships and planes, and we'll gain air superiority, and we'll begin to bomb German factories and Japanese factories, and we're going to cut the enemy's ability to produce while we continue to produce. Our industrial complex is a big part of why we're going to win this war. Now, as the war continues, the Japanese invaded the Philippines right down here, which belong to us. General Douglas MacArthur, who will end up being the general in charge of the war in the Pacific, he is forced to withdraw from the Philippines in the face of a Japanese attack, to retreat his men from there so we can use them to fight later. But he promises he will return. Now, after taking the Philippines, the Japanese are then looking to continue to expand throughout the Pacific. And the next big battle is going to be the Battle of the Coral Sea. In this first major naval engagement, our aircraft carriers square off with Japanese carriers, and it's really kind of, the fight is a draw. But the fact that we fought them to a draw meant that they could not sweep our ships from the area. That meant they could not continue to invade further south towards Australia. So we've stopped Japanese progress in the south. Then, at Midway Island, the main Japanese fleet and the main American fleet clash in, at that point, the biggest naval battle that had happened in history. And we defeated the Japanese fleet. Our aircraft carriers match up with their aircraft carriers. We managed to sink several of their carriers, hundreds of their planes, and the Japanese fleet will never be the same. Meanwhile, we'll keep building more and more ships. So that stops Japanese progress. But they had already taken literally hundreds of islands all over the Pacific. So it's going to take us time to recapture these islands. So we begin down here at a little place called Guadalcanal. This is our first landing where we start taking back islands. But it's going to take a while to do this. And do we want to put all of our efforts into the Pacific, or do we need to put our efforts into Europe? And ultimately, the United States decided we need to focus on beating Germany first, because the Russians are on their last legs. The English have been holding out. Either one of them could collapse at any time. We need to get over there while we still got allies. Then we can come back and finish the Japanese. Now, we'll still fight in the Pacific the whole time, but our major efforts are going to be focused on Europe. So, the Russians, who are now our allies, they are begging us, open a front in Europe, invade France, make Germany pull their troops out of Russia to fight you on the other side of the continent so we can have some relief. But we know we're not quite ready for that. So our first attack is going to come down here in North Africa. Dwight Eisenhower will be, the American commander, will be the commander of the Allied forces in the West. They'll command the British, American, and French troops combined together. And our first attack comes in North Africa, the weak spot. And our troops get their feet wet. They kind of learn what they're doing. They make mistakes, but they figure it out, and they capture North Africa. After capturing North Africa, the Russians are still begging us to invade France, but we don't feel like we're strong enough yet. Instead, we figure Italy is a much weaker target. And so we then invade Italy. And Mussolini is chased from power. Ultimately, he flies to Germany, and Hitler, when he arrives in Germany, sticks him right back on a plane and sends him right back to Italy to keep fighting. He's captured by his own people and executed. So Italy forms a new government, and they surrender. Now, the Germans still have troops there that we continue fighting for another year, but Italy has fallen. Finally, in June of 1944, our invasion force in England is ready to launch that major attack into France. And so on what is called D-Day, Allied forces invade the beachheads of northern France and begin pushing into France. And once we do that, now the Germans are in trouble. There's a two-front war going on. They're fighting now in France and in Russia. They are going to have to pull some troops out of Russia now to fight us. And so now we're going to see the Russians and the other Western allies pushing across France, pushing across Russia, pushing the Germans back. And so in a last-ditch effort, the Germans decide to pull every available soldier they can out of Russia and put them on the Western front and to hit us as hard as they can. They hope if they hit us hard enough, we'll agree to make peace with them and go finish off the Japanese, and they'll admit that they lost to us, and we'll get all of our stuff back. But they want us to agree that the Russians, the communists, are the real threat, and let them continue that war against Russia. So they threw everything they had at us and created a bulge in the line. And this was called the Battle of the Bulge. But we're not going for that. We're not going to accept anything short of complete victory over the Nazis, because we know they're evil. And so our troops heroically fight through a hard winter. They hammer out that bulge, and they continue to push into Germany. Over on the other side, the Russians continue to drive the Germans back, and so the Germans are in retreat. At this point, the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill of England, and Stalin of Russia, meet face to face. And they start making agreements on how we're going to rebuild Europe after the war. And there's agreements made that each country will rebuild whichever nations they liberate, and they'll hold elections and let those people choose their new governments. We have to make an agreement on who's going to get to capture Berlin. The Russians want to capture it for plain, flat-out revenge. And we realize, hey, it's going to be costly to capture Berlin. We could get there first, but it would cost us a lot of troops, and we still have to fight the Japanese. And hey, we want the Russians to help us fight the Japanese. They were not at war with Japan yet. And so we made an agreement. We'll let them capture Berlin if they promise that they will immediately, once the Germans surrender, they will then declare war on Japan. So ultimately, we capture Berlin, the Russians do, and the Germans will surrender.
So May 8th, 1945 is victory in Europe. The war against Germany is over.
Meanwhile, over in the Pacific, the United States has begun what's called the island hopping campaign, where rather than capture every single last one of the islands that the Japanese soldiers are on, we're going to capture an island. Then we're going to skip the next several islands and capture an island here as a base. Then we'll skip a bunch more islands and capture another island. And the reason is we have gained control of the waters. We're whipping and destroying the Japanese Navy. And those soldiers on those islands, they're trapped there. They're no threat to us. They can't get off and mass somewhere else. So if we just capture one island at a time as a base and then skip several islands, we'll get closer and closer to Japan itself and try to win the war. But we do take a detour. MacArthur, who's in charge of our troops over in the Pacific, he promised he would go back to the Philippines, which was in American possession and where there were Americans in prison there as well as Filipinos, and he had made a commitment to go rescue them. And so the United States diverts, and we send troops to capture the Philippines rather than continuing straight on to Japan. And so in the biggest naval battle that's ever happened in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, what's left of the Japanese fleet fights the American fleet. This is where they first used kamikaze pilots to load up their airplane with just enough fuel to fly to our fleet. The rest of the planes loaded with explosives, and they crash their planes into our ships trying to sink them. But ultimately, we win the battle, and we land our troops, and we liberate the Philippines. The next important island we capture is going to be Iwo Jima. Now, it's famous for the picture of the flag being raised over Iwo Jima. But the most important thing about this island is it's going to be an air base where once we capture it, we can then start launching planes that fly to Japan, drop their bombs, and return. We can start round-the-clock bombing of Japan. And so we're now beginning to bomb their homeland. Our next attack then comes here at the tip of the chain of Japanese islands at an island called Okinawa, which is part of Japan. So we attack Okinawa. And when we attack Okinawa, the people and the military retreated to the mountains, and they fought to the finish. And it was bloody, and it was costly. And we realized after capturing Okinawa, if we have to land in Japan and actually try to take the main island, the body count's going to be staggering. Estimates are that we'll lose somewhere around another 100,000 Americans. And the Japanese death toll will be in the millions. It's going to be a bloodbath if we invade Japan. So we do have an option. We've developed the atomic bomb. But now that we have this super weapon, do we want to use it? Truman has to weigh the options here, and he decides that we have this weapon that could end the war and save American lives. We need to use it. So on August 6th, 1945, the first atomic bomb is dropped in warfare. The United States bombs Hiroshima. It was a military target. There were bases there. There were factories there. And it devastates the town. The Japanese don't know quite what's hit them. And they don't surrender immediately. So 3 days later, we dropped our other atomic bomb on Nagasaki, which also wrecks the town. 2 bombs destroyed 2 towns. It's unheard of devastation. And it's the only nuclear war to this point that has been fought in human history. The United States is the only country to have ever used nuclear weapons against anyone in human history to this point. So, after dropping these 2 atomic bombs, the Japanese finally begin negotiating, and they agreed to surrender. So World War II comes to an end. But almost as soon as it does, the United States and our former ally, the Soviet Union, begin a new conflict, the Cold War, which is going to dominate most of the rest of the 20th century.